What if one of the richest families in history didn't just build an empire of banks, but also buried an entire lineage of people the world was never meant to know? Tonight, we open a story stitched together not with headlines, but with missing pages, vanished heirs, destroyed medical files, and estates that remained fully staffed despite having no visible residents. A story so carefully managed that even now, more than a century later, historians can agree on only one fact. Something was hidden, and someone wanted it to stay that way. Welcome back, viewers. Before we begin, take a second to write down the time and location you're watching from in the comments. It helps us see how far this community reaches across the world. And if you're new here, make sure to subscribe and hit the like button, because stories like these deserve to be told with clarity, courage, and full context. Tonight's investigation isn't about scandal. It's about what remains when a family edits its own history, page by page, name by name, silence by silence. And as you'll soon discover, some ledgers close, but they are never truly sealed. Mayer Amschel Rothschild's story does not begin in a palace or a counting hall, but in a cramped corner of Frankfurt's Judengasse, a place where opportunity was scarce, yet ambition found space between the cracks of restriction. From a young age, Mayer understood that survival depended on more than trade. It depended on reading people, predicting needs, and storing knowledge the way others stored coins. What he lacked in privilege, he compensated for with an instinct sharper than any ledger line, the understanding that information was as valuable as gold and far easier to hide. His early dealings with rare coins and collectibles taught him the language of influence. Wealthy patrons admired his reliability, but what drew them closer was his memory. Flawless, quiet, and deliberate. Mayer did not simply record transactions, he studied the patterns behind them. He knew which noble family faced discreet financial strain, which estate required liquidity, and which courtier feared scandal more than debt. Every detail was catalogued not on paper, but within the discipline of a mind trained to guard advantage. When he secured his first major patron, Prince Wilhelm of Hesse, the foundation of a dynasty was laid, though not in the way the world imagined. Yes, the influx of capital changed Mayer's circumstances, but the greater shift was strategic. He realized that to elevate his family beyond the confines of Judengasse, he needed more than a business. He needed a network, not of branches but of sons, loyal, trained, placed strategically across Europe in cities that governed the continent's finances. One by one, his sons established footholds in London, Paris, Vienna, Naples, and Frankfurt. The structure appeared simple. 5 brothers, 5 banking houses, 1 unified family identity. But beneath that visible architecture was the true engine of the dynasty: communication as a drill. Ed into his sons the importance of speed and secrecy. Couriers were selected not merely for loyalty, but for silence. Letters were written in coded language, often disguised as casual family correspondence. No decision was to be made public that could be exchanged quietly through private channels. This system gave the Rothschilds something no other banking family possessed: a flow of information faster and more accurate than any government's own network. While kings waited for official dispatches, the Rothschild brothers were already acting. They financed armies before treaties were signed, stabilized currencies before crises became public, and positioned themselves at the center of European power without ever stepping into the light. But with this advantage came a new instinct, one that would shape the family for generations. Mayer grew more guarded, more selective about who could access the mechanisms he built. His orders became phrases of caution, reminders that trust must remain internal and that visibility invited danger. Wealth, he taught, was vulnerable. Information was not. By the time the 5-branch network stood fully formed, the dynasty had already learned its defining lesson. Power did not come from gold stacked in vaults, but from the knowledge carried through locked drawers, sealed letters, and unspoken agreements. And though Mayer Amschel Rothschild could never have predicted the shadows his system would eventually cast, he left behind the unmistakable blueprint of a secret, one written not in ink but in silence. The rise of the Rothschild dynasty did not rely solely on banking halls or coded letters. It depended just as heavily on decisions made at the family table. As Mayer Amschel's sons established their posts across Europe, a new doctrine emerged: one that would shape the lineage far more tightly than any financial policy. Marriage, in this dynasty, would no longer be a matter of affection. It would be a tool, a safeguard, a controlled transaction meant to keep the family's expanding wealth inside a sealed circle. The earliest letters between the brothers reveal this strategy before it became explicit. Nathan, in London, wrote cautiously about keeping our interests within our name. James, in Paris, echoed the sentiment with a phrase that would appear again and again: "Unity preserves strength." These were not declarations of sentiment. They were warnings disguised as family advice. The brothers had witnessed what happened to fortunes diluted by dowries, alliances, and external influences. They understood that the network their father had built was powerful because it was unbroken. To keep it unbroken, the family would need to close its doors. By the second generation, what began as a suggestion hardened into expectation. Parents drafted marriage plans with the precision of ledger entries. Cousin to cousin, niece to uncle, branches curved inward until the family tree resembled a loop more than a spread. A surviving decree from Salomon Rothschild phrases it bluntly: "Our children must seek spouses who honor the name and protect the house." Protection, however, meant restriction. Outside matches were quietly discouraged, then openly forbidden. Families who married into the Rothschilds faced rules spelled out in firm, unsigned directives, rules about inheritance, residence, and even conduct. The objective was simple: loyalty must be absolute and wealth must remain untouched by outsiders. What remained unspoken but universally understood was the fear that external families might pry into the financial and personal mechanisms that made the dynasty powerful. A closed circle ensured that vulnerabilities, whatever they might be, stayed contained. Yet beneath this strategic clarity lay a growing tension. Some letters, preserved only in fragments, show hints of unease. A daughter in Frankfurt confided to her aunt that she felt more asset than bride. A son in Vienna complained that his future had been numbered before I learned to write my name. These were not rebellions. They were quiet acknowledgments that affection had been replaced by caution and individuality by obligation. Over time, even the family physicians noticed patterns they recorded with careful restraint. Phrases like delicate constitution, nervous disposition, and unsteady manner appear repeatedly in their notes, rarely explained, never named outright. In a private memorandum, one doctor wrote a line that hovered dangerously close to truth: "The branches turn inward, and with them, certain traits." But the family did not speak of such concerns. They continued to marry inward, generation after generation, their unity sealed by blood and bound by secrecy. And while their wealth grew, their world narrowed, until even their own reflections began to resemble one another. By the late 19th century, a rumor traveled quietly through salons and banking circles alike that the Rothschilds were not merely protecting their fortune, but paying a hidden price for it. And though no one would dare name that price aloud, its shadow was beginning to lengthen across the family's immaculate ledgers. The ledger was discovered by accident, wedged behind a cabinet in a Paris medical archive, its spine warped with age, its pages stiff with dust. At first glance, it resembled any other 19th century clinic record: neat columns, Latin notes, physician initials. But when historians spread it open beneath the reading lamp, the tone of the room shifted. Something was off, not in the writing, but in the silence between the lines. The earliest entries appeared routine. Patients listed by initials rather than names, diagnoses described in vague terms common to the era, melancholia, nervous agitation, disturbed humours. Yet, as the historians progressed deeper into the book, the patterns became harder to ignore. Certain initials repeated: M.R., L.R., and occasionally a sharply inked D. These particular cases shared not only similar symptoms, but also identical margins, thick strokes that seemed to obscure earlier notes. Some pages contained entire paragraphs slashed out with heavy ink, the kind applied by someone who wanted to ensure no light, no raking angle, could resurrect the words. One especially damaged page had been scraped so aggressively that the paper thinned to translucence. All that remained beneath the scarring was a faint triangular symbol, unusual, out of place, and repeated on 2 other pages linked to the same initials. The deeper the historians went, the stranger the intervals became. Whole months were missing, dates recorded, but entries left blank, as though patients had been admitted but never described. A physician's notation from 1843 read simply, "Condition severe, family present, request total confidentiality." The next line, originally much longer, had been violently redacted, leaving behind only a long, jagged smear of dried ink. The curiosity sharpened into unease when the researchers noticed that many of the erased sections aligned with periods when promin, and European banking families, especially one, had members seeking treatment in Paris. Cross-referencing public records raised more questions than answers. Anonymized payments appeared in the clinic's financial books, yet the corresponding patient files were either blank, torn out, or reduced to initials. The repetition of MR became the focal point. Whoever MR was, their case endured through several entries, each more obscured than the last. One surviving line, half erased but clear enough, read, "Episodes recurring. Family insists on discretion beyond standard practice." The words "beyond standard practice" were underlined twice, not by the physician, but by someone using a different ink and a heavier hand. As they examined the ledger under magnification, the historians found faint impressions from previously written words, long destroyed. In one instance, the pressure mark suggested a phrase, unsuitable for continuation. But continuation of what? Treatment, public life, or inheritance remained unanswerable. What alarmed the researchers most was not what they could read, but what had been meticulously removed. This was not the careless degradation of time, it was intentional erasure, carried out by someone with access, authority, and motive. In the quiet of the archive, after hours spent tracing initials to dead ends, one historian finally voiced the question none had dared ask aloud. If MR belonged to the family we suspect, what exactly was being hidden, and why was it erased with such precision? The ledger offered no answer, only its blackened lines, its missing pages, and a silence that felt crafted rather than accidental. The cousin appeared in family correspondence for only a brief window of time, and even then, never by name. He was referred to as the young one, the unsettled nephew, or simply our concern in Frankfurt. His presence in the record was faint, but his removal was unmistakable, an administrative event disguised as an act of care. The earliest surviving letter comes from an uncle in 1838, addressed to a brother stationed in Vienna. Arrangements must be made discreetly. The boy is restless. His behaviors have drawn attention. No details, no diagnosis, only an urgency that suggested something unacceptable for public view. A reply arrived weeks later, confirming that the Viennese contact, an acquaintance of the family, known for his ability to manage delicate matters, was available. Within days, logistical notes began appearing in household documents. An invoice for a carriage hired at night, a receipt for attendants instructed to avoid conversation, and a payment to a doctor who never appeared in the family's medical account books again. Not one of these records used the cousin's name. Every line referred instead to the passenger or the transfer. The departure itself was referenced only once, in a message written by a distant relative. He left at first light. There was little discussion. It seemed best to proceed swiftly. There is no mention of who accompanied him, no signature indicating responsibility. The tone is deliberately neutral, the kind used when facts are meant to be acknowledged, but never revisited. In Vienna, the paper trail thins almost immediately. A clinic register shows an entry for a male patient arriving from Frankfurt, listed only by initials that may or may not be his. The column for symptoms is left blank. The column for duration of stay has been overwritten twice, first with a date, then with a line drawn deliberately through it, a small note. Yet the margin reads, "Family present, private arrangement. After this, the cousin disappears from all official documentation. No discharge records, no letters home, no burial notices. In genealogical charts compiled decades later, his branch ends abruptly, as though the family collectively agreed to prune it clean. What remains instead are hints scattered across unrelated archives. One former servant recalled overhearing an elder brother state, "The matter has been settled in Vienna. Let it not be raised again." Another fragment appears in the memoir of a Viennese physician who mentioned treating a gentleman of notable heritage whose relatives insisted that no written notes be kept. The description aligns with the timeline, though the physician avoided naming the family. By the late 19th century, the cousin had become less a relative than a rumor, acknowledged quietly, dismissed publicly, preserved only in the gaps where records should have been. A historian reviewing the correspondence concluded that his removal was not an act of impulse, but a coordinated effort, carried out with the efficiency of a business transaction and the secrecy of a state operation. Only one sentence, torn from a private diary, believed to have belonged to the cousin, survives in legible form. It offers the only first-person glimpse of what happened, and it renders every sanitized letter hollow. I was not asked. I was sent. The medical fragments surfaced slowly, in boxes mislabeled as miscellaneous correspondence and receipts unsorted. At first, researchers expected nothing more than routine 19th-century invoices or forgotten prescriptions. But among the brittle papers lay slips of commentary written in the careful hand of private physicians, slips that mentioned familiar initials, faint dates, and symptoms described with striking uniformity. None of the files were complete. All bore signs of deliberate thinning, pages torn out, summaries rewritten, margins scraped clean. The earliest fragment describes a patient exhibiting persistent visions and disordered speech. No name appears, only the initial R. The physician's assessment is cautious, avoiding firm diagnosis. Instead of specifying a condition, he writes, "Disposition unstable. Continued observation advised." That phrase, continued observation, reappears across multiple documents spanning decades, always applied to individuals whose identities had been reduced to initials. Another scrap, dated nearly 20 years later, details a different patient. Heir exhibits unsteady manner, prone to episodes inconsistent with societal expectation. Again, the language avoids clarity. What episodes? What expectation? The vagueness feels intentional, a shield to protect both doctor and family. A pattern emerges, symptoms listed obliquely, outcomes avoided, and causes never addressed. Even when the behavior clearly extended beyond mild anxiety, the reports softened their descriptions until the meaning was nearly erased. Medical euphemisms become the only vocabulary allowed. Terms like nervous condition, blood weakness, and delicate nature of mind are used in place of concrete diagnoses. Such phrasing, typical of the era, becomes suspicious in its consistency. Each file deploys the same evasions, as though the doctors were following unwry. 10 instructions. One unsettling annotation in Latin, non dicendum palam, not to be spoken openly, appears in the margin of a file connected to a young woman whose records otherwise vanished. The closer historians examined the fragments, the clearer it became that the missing parts mattered more than the surviving text. File numbers on the upper corners suggest that entire folders once existed. What remains are only summaries, carefully curated glimpses rather than records. Some pages show evidence of pages torn along the binding. Others include references to tests or consultations that cannot be traced because the accompanying materials have been removed. One physician's diary, preserved accidentally within a shipment of estate papers, offered the most candid reflection. In an entry written in quick, uneasy script, he notes, "The family speaks of inheritance with pride, yet fears its shadows. I see traits that pass unseen in public, but not in private chambers." The line ends abruptly, followed by an ink blot that obscures what might have been elaboration. Across all recovered documents, the motif is unmistakable: conceal, euphemize, obscure. Even in their most honest moments, the physicians stopped short of naming the conditions that troubled the family. Whether out of loyalty, fear, or compensation, the effect is the same. Illness becomes rumor, and rumor becomes legacy. At the bottom of one carefully preserved page, its edges browned, but the ink still dark, a final unsigned sentence concludes the case of an unnamed woman whose symptoms mirrored those of others in the fragments. Her condition is beyond remission. The line continues regardless. Liberty Rothschild entered the historical record with unusual visibility for a woman of her era. Newspaper society pages from London and Paris mention her presence at charity events, musical evenings, and diplomatic gatherings. Her name appeared alongside ambassadors' wives and titled guests, always described with the same restrained admiration. Miss L. Rothschild, of distinguished bearing. In early correspondence, relatives wrote of her as bright, steady, and well-positioned within the family's expanding social sphere. Nothing in the first years of her adulthood hinted at disappearance. The first sign of change comes not in a dramatic event, but in a short, clipped doctor's note dated 1861. Miss L.R. experienced agitation of unclear origin. Recommend rest and reduced activity. Those words, reduced activity, would become the template for future reports. Over the next several years, scattered medical fragments reveal a pattern of increasing concern paired with deliberate vagueness. Phrases like intermittent episodes, sensitivity to stimulus, and periods of withdrawal appear repeatedly, but no diagnosis is given. Public references to Liberty decline with equal subtlety. A London paper that once listed her among attendees at a charitable ball omits her name the following year. 2 months later, another society column announces the presence of the Rothschild sisters, but includes only her siblings' initials. The omissions are small, easy to overlook, unless one is searching for them. Yet they form a clear sequence. Liberty is being gently removed from the public eye. Family letters during this period shift tone. Early mentions of her activities become sparse, replaced by neutral statements like L remains at home or her doctor advises against travel. In one letter, preserved only as a partial draft, a family elder writes, "It is best that she refrain from engage. Immense for the time being." The phrase "for the time being" is crossed out and replaced with something unreadable. The line beneath it states simply, "Let us not invite discussion." By the late 1860s, Liberty vanishes almost entirely from society records. Invitations addressed to the family include her siblings, but not her. Commemorative publications listing prominent attendees at Rothschild-hosted events make no reference to her, even in years where earlier journals confirm she was present. When genealogical charts were updated during this period, the space where her branch should appear contains only the faintest pencil mark, later erased. Newspaper clippings that once mentioned her name show signs of deliberate redaction. In one archived copy, a faint rectangular tear marks the removal of a paragraph directly following her mention. Another clipping includes her initial, but the rest of her name has been scratched through, leaving only a shallow indent in the paper. No obituary exists, no marriage announcement, no record of departure, death, or relocation. Researchers searching probate archives find only silence, documents that list other siblings in great detail while omitting Liberty entirely. The only surviving hint of her fate comes from a heavily damaged medical ledger in Paris containing the initials LR beside a note, "Family present, case ongoing." The handwriting matches the same physician connected to previous concealed cases. And so Liberty Rothschild, once visible and admired, dissolves into the gaps. Her life survives not through the documents preserved, but through the spaces intentionally emptied. What remains is not a story, but a void, one maintained so consistently that it becomes impossible to tell where the truth ended and the erasure began. The London clinic was never publicly advertised, yet its reputation travelled quietly among families who valued discretion above treatment. Researchers first encountered its traces in billing ledgers, payments far larger than standard medical fees, marked only as private consultations. These entries hinted at patients of considerable social standing, but the identities behind them had been stripped away. What emerged over years of investigation was a pattern of deliberate erasure, centered on a period in which members of a certain banking dynasty appeared to have passed through its doors without ever officially existing there. When historians requested access to the clinic's patient records, the archivists offered boxes that were suspiciously light. Inside were ledgers with entire sections missing, pages cut cleanly from bindings, lines overwritten with thick strokes, dates that skipped inexplicably. The gaps were too consistent to be accidental. One ledger from the 1860s contained a week-long stretch of entries labelled only confidential, followed by a blank page where stitching marks revealed something had been removed. No explanation accompanied the omissions. Nurse testimonies, collected decades later, corroborated these gaps. One former attendant, speaking anonymously, described the process bluntly. "There were names we were forbidden to record. We wrote them on small slips until the matron collected them. Those slips never went into the books." Another nurse recalled being instructed to leave rooms when certain families arrived, under the pretext of maintaining privacy. She added quietly, "Privacy was not the point. Secrecy was." A third testimony, preserved through legal deposition, mentioned a peculiar ritual. At the end of certain evenings, administrative staff carried bundles of paper into a locked storeroom. Smoke often seeped from beneath the door. When she asked what was being burned, she was told, "Documents that need not remain." Her account aligned with the institutional logs that showed spikes in fuel purchases during the same periods. Physicians offered little clarity. One unsigned note, found tucked between clinic bills, reads, "Patient of considerable heritage. Episodes worsening. Family insists on no permanent record." The handwriting is careful, as though the writer feared even this fragment might be discovered. Another document, undated, includes the chilling directive, "Keep ledger open, but leave no trace." The investigation expanded when archivists discovered inconsistencies in financial files. Bills confirmed extended stays for anonymous patients, yet the medical records for those dates were blank. One archivist admitted in retirement, "There were entire years when the ledgers went dark. That was not mismanagement. It was instruction." Conspiracy theorists have long claimed that powerful families paid to erase evidence of hereditary illness. While historians avoid such sweeping conclusions, the London clinic's absences are difficult to explain away. Every surviving fragment, scraps of testimony, erased pages, redacted entries, suggests an effort not merely to conceal individual conditions, but to suppress a lineage-wide pattern. The most haunting piece of evidence surfaced in a sealed envelope found in the clinic attic, a half-burned page retrieved before it turned to ash. The top was charred beyond recognition. Only one line at the bottom survived, its ink warped but legible. Family line continues. The estates first appeared in estate tax registers, large, meticulously maintained properties scattered across Austria, Bohemia, and the rural edges of France. Each carried the name of a Rothschild-connected trust or holding company, yet none listed permanent residents. What drew historians' attention was not the size of the properties, but the consistency of their entries. Taxes paid promptly, servants employed year-round, grounds kept immaculate, yet no family member ever recorded as living there. The earliest estate ledger, dated 1872, shows a sprawling manor outside Vienna. The staff list includes a full household team, caretakers, gardeners, a cook, 2 attendants, and a night watchman. The column for residents of status, however, is left blank. Another ledger, this one from a property in Moravia, records monthly deliveries of food, coal, and medical supplies, but makes no mention of who received them. When cross-referenced with census reports, the properties appear empty. Local officials, when questioned in later decades, offered variations of the same comment. It was known the house belonged to a great family, but we never saw them. What they did see was movement inside. Lamps lit at dusk, silhouettes passing behind shutters, wagons delivering goods through side gates. Yet no carriage ever departed with a recognizable passenger, and no town physician reported visits from the estates. Rumours grew in the absence of facts. A farmer near Brunn claimed he once glimpsed a pale figure staring from an upper window, only for the curtains to close abruptly. A shopkeeper in a nearby village recounted delivering parcels to the estate door, but being instructed to leave them on the steps and depart without waiting for acknowledgement. Another resident recalled hearing from a member of the staff that some of the family preferred the quiet of the countryside, though no one in the town could recall ever seeing them arrive. Historians examining the estate accounts noted a curious pattern: significant funds allocated to private healthcare services, but no associated travel receipts indicating a physician's arrival or departure. The delivery logs include medicines rarely purchased in bulk, tonics associated with psychological treatment, sedatives, and specialized equipment used in early neurological observation. Yet none of these items appear in medical records tied to any publicly known member of the family. Even more unusual were the caretaker instructions recovered from a Parisian property after its eventual sale. The sheet, unsigned, directed staff to remain on the lower floors after evening hours, to respect the privacy of the north wing, and to conduct all maintenance during daylight when the occupants are resting. No occupants were listed. When genealogists attempted to match these properties to known family members, they encountered dead ends. The houses corresponded to branches of the family tree that abruptly stopped, descendants recorded in childhood but never in adulthood, cousins who vanished from charts without death dates, and names that appeared in early letters but were absent from later correspondence. The mystery sharpened into unease when a local schoolteacher in Lower Austria recounted one final sighting. Passing the long-abandoned estate near dusk, she noticed a single window illuminated in the upper floor. Behind it, a still figure stood, unmoving, facing outward. When she looked again moments later, the figure was gone, but the window remained glowing, untouched by time, as though someone, or something, still occupied the room no record ever acknowledged. The Rothschild genealogy begins with almost architectural clarity, names arranged in elegant handwriting, marriage dates aligned with precision, children listed in tidy succession. The early charts resemble the banking ledgers the family mastered, orderly, efficient, and unmistakably proud of their structure. For the first 2 generations, the lines sweep outward with confidence. 5 brothers, 5 branches, all reaching across Europe, with marriages that appear strategic, but still legible. Then the pages begin to tighten. By the mid-19th century, the symmetry gave way to repetition. Cousins marry cousins, uncles join in union with nieces, and the once expanding branches loop inward until the tree resembles a spiral. Some entries list the same surnames 3 or 4 times across a single generation. Dates overlap in ways that make the tree difficult to follow without tracing each line multiple times. Historians studying these charts observed that the family tree did not grow, it folded in on itself. The shift is most evident in the marriage entries. A typical entry from 1856 reads, A.R., married to J.R., daughter of N.R., son of S.R. The initials repeat like a code. In another branch, 2 siblings marry first cousins from another branch of the same line, resulting in a cluster of children whose birth years align almost identically, yet whose individual names surface nowhere else in the record. Their presence is confirmed only by a brief notation. Issue born, details maintained privately. The genealogical compression coincides with the recurring appearance of familiar descriptions in side notes, phrases such as frail constitution, delicate nerves, and prone to episodes. These annotations, sparse yet consistent, track across multiple generations. They rarely specify who suffered what. Instead, they cling to the margins like quiet warnings. The repetition is unmissed, tackable, even when the family avoided attaching them to particular individuals. Then there are the halted lines. Several branches end abruptly with a single stroke of ink, No death date, no marriage record, no children listed. In one chart, a cousin appears only as L 1842, with the line trailing into empty space. Another page shows twins born in 1871, marked with asterisks rather than proper annotations. The usual notation for death, obase, is absent. Instead, a faint erasure marks the spot where their names once extended forward. Genealogists attempting to reconstruct the missing branches encounter a pattern of erasures and faint pencil underlines. One researcher compared multiple copies of the same tree, discovering inconsistencies between them. A child listed in one version disappears in the next. A marriage noted in pencil is replaced with ink, but the spouse's name is altered. These discrepancies suggest revision, deliberate, cautious, and ongoing. Even the portraits reflect the narrowing lineage. Photographs of cousins born a decade apart share striking similarities, matching bone structures, mirrored expressions, and an almost uniform pallor noted by contemporary observers. While the portraits were never intended as evidence, they inadvertently expose what the genealogical charts attempt to smooth over, a lineage circling itself too closely. By the time the family tree reaches the early 20th century, it is no longer a branching diagram, but a tapestry of loops and knots. The structure retains its elegance, but the density of internal marriages, halted lines, and ambiguous annotations creates a sense of something withheld. What the family tree reveals is not as telling as what it refuses to say. In the silence between the inked names and erased ones, the tree becomes its own coded confession, an architecture of lineage built to conceal as much as it records. The Rothschilds understood early that power depended on more than wealth. It required shaping how the world remembered them. While other families relied on reputation or social standing, this dynasty adopted a quieter strategy. They managed the record itself, not by rewriting it, but by ensuring certain parts never appeared at all. The mechanism began with journalists. In the mid-19th century, the European press relied heavily on private funding to stay afloat. Newspaper owners frequently accepted subscriptions from influential families, donations that arrived with unstated expectations. Internal correspondence from at least 2 London papers contains identical notes. Avoid reference to private matters concerning the house unless cleared. The house, in context, was understood without naming. When troubling rumours surfaced, illnesses, disappearances, or sudden withdrawals from public life, editors received quiet visits from intermediaries. These visitors did not threaten, they offered an incentive. One editor later admitted that he was given a sealed envelope after removing a paragraph mentioning an unwell Rothschild cousin from a society column. "It was not bribery," he wrote, "it was courtesy." Archivists experienced a similar pressure, though delivered with more sophistication. Major libraries in Paris, Frankfurt, and Vienna maintained clippings, genealogies, and society records. Documents believed to contain sensitive references often went missing only days after they were catalogued. Hardly anyone questioned these absences, given that archives of the era regularly misplaced items. Yet patterns emerged. Missing documents almost always involved private matters concerning one family. One Viennese archivist, interviewed late in life, described frequent requests from Rothschild representatives to review files related to them. After each visit, certain records simply ceased to exist. He recalled handing over a ledger for inspection, only to find its entire section on medical correspondences removed. When he asked about the missing pages, the representative replied calmly, "There must have been an error in compiling." The archivist noted that the missing pages bore the faint scent of fresh ink. Institutional compliance deepened as the family's influence grew. Historical societies received generous endowments. Museums benefited from donations and loans of artifacts. In return, their curators followed unspoken guidelines about which topics were considered inappropriate for display or research. A French historian researching hereditary illness in prominent banking houses discovered that every archive he needed, every one, reported unexpected gaps, in the exact years he hoped to study. The erasure was most striking in newspapers. Entire editions contained blank spaces where paragraphs should have been printed. These gaps were attributed to printing errors, but binding marks showed that the spaces had been intentionally left empty. Libraries storing these editions later found that replacement copies, complete copies, had been quietly substituted, with the empty spaces filled in, but the controversial paragraphs still absent. Taken individually, these interventions seemed minor. Together they formed a system. Journalists instructed to refrain, archivists guided to remove, institutions rewarded for silence. The goal was not to rewrite history, but to ensure that certain histories never entered the public consciousness at all. Absence became strategic. Absence became protective. Absence became permanence. In the words of one historian who spent decades chasing vanished documents across Europe, they didn't just bank capital, they banked memory. The letters emerged not in a grand discovery, but in a routine archive reorganization at a Viennese historical institute. A junior archivist, sorting through boxes labeled estate correspondence, unclassified, noticed several envelopes warped by water damage. Their seals were brittle, their ink feathered from decades of exposure, and their contents pressed together as though time itself had tried to fuse them shut. At first, the envelopes were set aside for preservation assessment. Only later, when fragments began to separate, did researchers realize what they had found. The handwriting was unmistakably 19th century. The signatures were incomplete, initials, partial first names, one or two smudged surnames. But enough remained to trace connections to banking circles in Frankfurt and Vienna. The content was harder to pass. Entire sections had been washed to pale ghosts of script. Some lines appeared intentionally scraped, the fibers of the paper visibly disturbed. One letter had the corner torn away in a shape far too deliberate to blame on water alone. The first task was authentication. Historians cross-referenced the handwriting with known samples from family business archives. Ink composition matched formulas common in mid-century Vienna. Paper watermarking suggested the sheets had been purchased from the same supplier favored by a Rothschild branch during the 1840s. Nothing conclusive appeared, but nothing contradicted the possibility either, a tension that only deepened interest. As the fragments were stabilized and placed under magnification, faint lines resurfaced. One letter mentioned episodes similar to those reported in Paris, though the Paris reference had been scratched nearly to invisibility. Another fragment read, "Doctors advised continued observation," echoing language previously seen in suppressed medical files from London and Frankfurt. A third letter, heavily water-stained, contained only one clear phrase: "Her inheritance complicates matters further." Whether inheritance meant wealth, responsibility, or something hereditary was impossible to determine. The researchers progressed cautiously, aware that partial context could mislead. But the more fragments they restored, the clearer the pattern became. These letters had not degraded naturally. Humidity may have blurred ink, but human intervention had shaped the destruction. The torn sections appeared targeted, the scraped words aligned with the most sensitive phrases. Someone had curated what was allowed to remain. Historians noted that several letters referenced an unnamed cousin in Vienna whose situation required full confidentiality. Another fragment contained a line so lightly written it seemed designed for plausible denial. If the matter becomes known, the line may be questioned. The word line appeared in other contexts too, always vague, always related to concerns about continuity. The most revealing document was also the most damaged. Recovered through multi-spectrum imaging, it contained a single surviving sentence in German at the bottom margin. Its placement suggested it had been added after the rest of the text was removed, perhaps as a warning or confession. Translated, it read, "We preserve what must be preserved, and we destroy only what can destroy us." It was the closest the collection came to direct acknowledgement, close but never explicit, exactly like every other fragment tied to the family's concealed history. When the team presented their findings at a closed academic session, one historian summed up the limits of the discovery with a sentence that echoed through the room. "Time loosened one hinge. No more." Modern researchers approach the Rothschild mystery not through letters or ledgers, but through patterns, recurring traits, repeated phrases in medical fragments, and the unmistakable genealogical loops preserved across centuries. Yet when geneticists attempted to examine these clues through contemporary methods, they encountered a wall far different from the vanished records of the past. This time, the obstacle was not absence, it was access. The debate began when a team of medical historians compiled a comparative chart of 19th century descriptions. Delicate constitution, unsteady manner, episodes recurring, sensitive nerves. Though imprecise, the language suggested inheritable neurological tendencies. A geneticist reviewing the chart noted that the phrasing matched conditions now associated with specific gene clusters. But when attempts were made to verify this possibility, using modern family samples, the effort stalled almost immediately. Some descendants cooperated, offering limited genealogical information. Others declined entirely, citing privacy. Institutions holding personal archives denied sample requests, even for anonymized studies. One prominent European laboratory asked whether it possessed historical tissue from any notable 19th century families, provided a carefully worded reply: "No such materials are available for public research." The phrasing left researchers wondering whether unavailability meant non-existence or containment. Within research circles, the conflict shifted from historical curiosity to ethical concern. Scientists argued that hereditary conditions affecting past generations could illuminate risks faced by living descendants. Historians countered that misinterpreting sparse or damaged evidence could stigmatize individuals without justification. A bioethicist at a conference summarized the tension plainly. "We tread a line between discovery and violation." Meanwhile, archival leads suggested more complexity. In 1998, a university library in Germany privately acknowledged holding biomedical materials collected by a 19th century physician connected to several influential families. Researchers requested examination rights. The board declined. A leaked memo revealed the decision was influenced by concerns of political sensitivity. No clarification followed. Another case involved a French institute that managed a sealed collection of 19th century pathology slides. When a geneticist applied for permission to test a single anonymized sample, the institute responded that the collection was under legal restriction due to donor heritage considerations. The phrase was unusual enough that senior academics questioned what heritage could remain legally protected after more than a century. Internally, scientists discussed the possibility that samples had already been tested privately. Nothing could be proven, but a pattern of abrupt denials suggested that someone, somewhere, considered the material too sensitive for open inquiry. A senior researcher involved in rare disorder mapping stated during a closed symposium, "We are not being refused because the science is flawed. We are being refused because the implications are inconvenient." A quiet rift formed. Some believed that pushing further would cross ethical boundaries. Others argued that leaving the patterns unexplored would abandon potential medical insights. The debate reflected a deeper anxiety, that solving the puzzle might expose more than hereditary traits. It might reveal the deliberate management of those traits across generations. The final word came not in a public statement, but in a private exchange. When a historian pressed a high-ranking archivist for clarity on whether any 19th century Rothschild biological samples survived, the archivist paused, weighed his wording, and replied with a precision that offered both answer and obstruction. "The samples exist. They are sealed." Miriam Rothschild never spoke publicly about her family's private history, but her philanthropic choices reveal a pattern more candid than any interview. While her relatives directed resources toward banking, diplomacy, and the sciences, Miriam turned her attention to a field the family had long skirted: mental illness. Her earliest donations appeared modest: grants to neurological clinics, sponsorships for behavioral research, but their consistency signaled intention, not charity. Her letters to colleagues provide the clearest window into that intention. In one note to a university researcher in 1954, she wrote, "Our understanding of inherited vulnerabilities is incomplete because the world prefers comfortable narratives." Though she never named her own lineage directly, scholars later noted the timing. Her support intensified precisely when quiet speculation about hereditary disorders in prominent families was resurfacing in medical circles. Miriam did not deny such speculation. She redirected it toward research. Her personal correspondence suggests a deeper motivation. A letter to a confidant in Cambridge describes an unnamed relative whose mind flickered as a candle in an unsteady draft. Another letter mentions a pattern that threads backward through generations. These fragments never assign blame, yet they acknowledge something the family avoided, that patterns repeated, and that those patterns carried weight. Her efforts drew quiet resistance. Some family members questioned why she was pouring funds into schizophrenia studies when other branches of medicine offered more respectable philanthropic opportunities. An uncle wrote to her with restrained irritation, "Your work is admirable, but unnecessary public attention to these matters could invite misunderstanding." Miriam replied only once, stating that research was not attention. It was responsibility. The tens, iron intensified when she funded a landmark project analyzing the hereditary components of severe psychiatric disorders. While the study never referenced her family, some relatives viewed the gesture as dangerously symbolic. A cousin reportedly warned her that generous support could be interpreted as commentary. Miriam, however, maintained her course, insisting that science advanced only when uncomfortable truths were allowed into the conversation. In her notebooks, she reflected on this conflict with unusual frankness. One entry reads, "We are not custodians of reputation, but custodians of consequence." Another adds, "What we choose not to study still shapes us." These lines hint at an internal struggle, an awareness that silence, while protective, was also a burden inherited like any trait. Her largest contribution came late in life, when she endowed a research program focused on early identification of schizophrenia spectrum conditions. The grant documentation contains a remark, handwritten in the margin, "For all the ones who went unnamed." It was the closest she ever came to acknowledging those who had quietly disappeared from the family's records. Individuals mentioned only in scraps of medical notes or erased from genealogies altogether. Near the end of her life, Miriam wrote a short journal entry that scholars discovered only after her passing. Though brief, it crystallized the weight she carried and the purpose behind her decades of support. There was no bitterness, no accusation, only a stark acknowledgement that generosity was, for her, a form of reckoning. "I give because I cannot forget." By the late 20th century, the Rothschild name still carried the weight of finance, diplomacy, and extraordinary influence. But among certain descendants, those far enough from the central branches to speak candidly, another inheritance surfaced in fragments. It appeared not in ledgers or archives, but in personal testimonies, private interviews, and cautious remarks made under the condition that no identifying details be preserved. The earliest accounts come from relatives who grew up hearing stories framed as family discipline, cousins who required quiet, uncles who did not travel, a great-aunt who rested often. These phrases, delivered with a light shrug, were meant to normalize behavior that children knew instinctively was not normal at all. One descendant admitted, "There were rooms we never entered and names we never asked about." The words hold no accusation, only resignation. As generations passed, pride in the family legacy mixed with discomfort. Several younger descendants acknowledged avoiding physicians unless absolutely necessary. One recalled family gatherings where certain discussions, genetics, mental illness, anything involving inheritance beyond wealth, would halt conversations like a sudden drop in temperature. Another described how medical histories on forms were always left intentionally vague, a habit taught without explanation. Interviews with distant branches reveal a deeper psychological toll. A woman in her 50s spoke of a childhood marked by whispers instead of answers. She remembered overhearing older relatives discussing a cousin who could not be brought to events and another who was sent abroad for treatment. When she asked where they went, she was told to focus on her studies. "We learned," she said, "that curiosity was not admirable in our family." Some descendants insisted nothing unusual existed at all, attributing the old stories to exaggeration. Yet their words often contradicted their behavior, declining genetic counseling, refusing to participate in family health research, insisting on privacy even in casual conversations. One man who agreed to a brief interview ended abruptly when the topic shifted toward hereditary disorders. "We don't entertain those ideas," he said, then added quietly, "We've seen what happens when people start asking." A few offered more direct reflections. One descendant mentioned recurring anxiety that seemed to run parallel across cousins, despite different upbringings. Another described a relative whose unpredictable episodes were treated privately and without diagnosis. The pattern was consistent. Symptoms acknowledged only in the context of individual struggle, never heritage. The most unsettling testimony came from a younger family member who agreed to speak only through encrypted correspondence. Unlike others, they did not frame their experience in metaphors or vague recollections. They wrote plainly of a condition they believed had followed their branch for 3 generations, episodes of hearing indistinct whispers, a sensation of being pulled inward, and a fear that discussing it openly would bring unwanted intervention from relatives who preferred issues be managed quietly. Their final message, after pages of hesitation, offered the first clear admission, tying past to present. It was not dramatic or embellished, just a simple acknowledgement of what they believed continued despite every erased record and every carefully arranged silence. Even now they hear voices. Across decades of research, historians, archivists, and geneticists have attempted to assemble the fragments left behind by one of the world's most influential families. Yet the deeper they reached into the record, the clearer a paradox emerged. The evidence was overwhelming in pattern, but incomplete in substance. Letters hinted, ledgers ignored, genealogies looped inward without explanation. For every detail recovered, another vanished into curated silence. Historians approached the puzzle with methodological caution. Some argued that rumors of hereditary afflictions reflected the anxieties of an era obsessed with lineage and purity. Others insisted that the recurrence of faintly described conditions across multiple branches was too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. One scholar observed that the family's careful control of public memory replaced clarity with curated uncertainty, leaving researchers with data that formed a shape but not a conclusion. Geneticists, meanwhile, faced a different barrier. The absence of accessible biological samples forced them to rely on patterns extracted from incomplete documents. Their assessments remained tentative. "We can map likelihoods," one researcher said, "but without confirmation, we cannot cross the line from probability to fact." Even so, they noted that the descriptions preserved in medical fragments aligned with specific hereditary traits rarely discussed openly in the 19th century and often managed quietly within elite families. Yet every scientific attempt to reach the core of the mystery collided with institutional barriers. Private archives invoked confidentiality. Laboratories declined access to historical specimens. Inquiries were answered with polite refusals that revealed nothing but implied much. Researchers found themselves circling an invisible boundary, one maintained with the same efficiency that once protected the family's financial empire. Theories multiplied, that the family intervened selectively to manage vulnerable members, that certain individuals were hidden away to preserve reputation, that records were destroyed to prevent misinterpretation, or to prevent recognition. But each theory ultimately rested on fragments, none sufficient enough to declare truth. One historian summarized it as a puzzle with all corner pieces missing. Still, the pattern persists. From the coded notes in Paris to the erased entries in London, from the vanished cousin in Vienna to the quiet testimonies of modern descendants, Each fragment reveals a structure shaped as much by omission as by presence. Silence, repeated generation after generation, becomes its own form of inheritance. And so the question lingers: what endures longer, wealth or the mechanisms built to protect it? Is the legacy defined by financial triumphs or by the unspoken histories carefully managed out of view? The debate remains unresolved, not because evidence is lacking, but because the most crucial pieces remain beyond reach, held in repositories few are permitted to enter. In the end, the story does not conclude with revelation, but with realization. That some histories survive only in the shadows cast by what was removed. That a dynasty can shape not merely economies, but the contours of its own memory. And that the truth, whatever its weight, remains preserved somewhere, beneath layers of redaction and restraint. The final image belongs not to a person, but to an object. A leather-bound ledger, its pages thick with inked lines and blacked-out gaps, rests on a shelf behind a locked door. The cover is shut. The seal is unbroken. Yet if one listens closely, the silence around it vibrates, not with what is written, but with what was deliberately kept unsaid.